It's so fun what we're going to be talking about over the next 30 minutes or so, talking about artificial intelligence, talking about the Israeli market, and really about how we're moving forward. I do hear a little bit of an echo, so perhaps we would need to be muting each other while we speak. I'll give a very brief introduction to Roy and then about myself, and we'll dive into some fun conversation. Roy is a managing partner at AnD. He drives the company building and corporate joint ventures. Now, before AnD, he founded the Google Global Accelerators program, and he built Google's corporate development company builder for Google's own investments. So a lot of experience within a huge corporation, working with corporations around the world, but also very actively involved in the Israeli market. On my end, I am 25 right now. I finished my Army service in the 8200 cybersecurity units. I spent many years in cybersecurity in conjunction with artificial intelligence, which brought me to Stanford University. There, I'm doing artificial intelligence research while also actively involved in the early stage ecosystem, both as an investor, but also as a young entrepreneur. And I'm incredibly excited to be here. So Roy, let's kick it off.
Super cool, and thank you for the introduction. And we're going to talk about AI, and AI provides the speed to technical products. And I think, as you've heard from Michael, he speaks at the speed of AI. And we love it. So let's kick it off with a little bit of an intro to the world of AI. What do we mean when we talk about machine learning? Michael, this is kind of your education and experience. So if you had to give a layman's term overview of machine learning and AI, what would that be for you?
I think the way that I like to think of it, both in the first week that I studied it in our military context, but also now day to day, it's just this idea of being able to take billions or trillions of data points and make sense of them in a way that nobody else could ever. No number of humans put in the same room on the same problem could do what a single microchip can do today in terms of finding patterns across millions of data points, which really is why this is a revolution. And there's nothing the genius about it. It's just this idea of taking a bunch of neurons, putting them together to come up with these insights that otherwise we wouldn't be able to come up with them.
Super cool. And as somebody who's been driving startup programs for Google, I have to say that in the 6 years that I have built Google's portfolio around the world, what used to be a niche or a vertical has become basically the fuel of how every company should think about its strategic positioning. And as we like to say it, when you build a successful model or a successful product, it's easy to copy feature set, it's easy to copy a workflow. But when you build your strategy on data and your feature set and capabilities are built on your economics of scale, that is very difficult for a new competitor to come into the market. And again, this is nothing new. If you look at how Google built itself, if you look at how Facebook built itself, it's all on leveraging data and basically using machine learning. What happened in the last couple of years is that through the revolution in cloud and through the revolution in many tools that enable you to develop very, very quickly, it has become a commodity. It's become basically something that every startup and every product engineer in the world can leverage and build into what they're doing. I think, the interesting way of looking at AI, Michael, as we kind of looked at what's happening around the world, and I'd love to get your perspective, kind of what you see in Stanford. Basically, what do students who start their way in the tech world in Stanford learn, and how AI became kind of an integral part of it. But I think we're kind of seeing a global race. If you think about, what coal and what fuel and what energy has done in different business sectors in the past, machine learning and data basically has become the most expensive commodity, or that rare commodity that everybody is trying to get their hands on in order to build their competitive advantage. And as you look at Israel, we are early adapters of any advanced technology. And I think, according to what Lee said before, it's true that the education on advanced technologies starts in the military, comes from the universities, but I think it's about the developer ecosystem that you have in Israel. of developers who are always looking to learn what's new and what's cutting edge and adopt anything and any idea that can drive them forward, which kind of positioned Israel as one of the leading contestants in this war of data, or let's say it in the positive way, of developing new technologies and disrupting verticals with the use of data, with using the AI engine. And, you know, over 1,500 active Israeli startups today. We're third only to the US and China, which is kind of amazing to think about the Israeli population and how many developers we have in total. And it also infiltrated into the Israeli government strategy for the next 5 years by investing in the AI sector, which is basically investing in the data sector in Israel. But going back to you, Michael, you know, Stanford, one of the best universities on the planet to study in. I don't want to flatter you too much by even asking you how did you get accepted, because we know that for every seat there's thousands of people who are trying to get in. What did you see from the Stanford kind of building the education of next generation and how that relates to AI?
I think it's a fantastic question. And I think that I come from an interesting intersection where I got to both see the educational side of it in Israel and the thinking behind artificial intelligence innovation in the Israeli ecosystem and also at Stanford. So starting from the end, which is where I'm now at Stanford, I'm saying, you know, if 10 years ago you had, you know, 1,000 students every year studying computer science, artificial intelligence was perhaps 1 or 2 courses as part of that whole curriculum. Today, we're looking at an entire track that when you get accepted to Stanford, you're basically committing to studying artificial intelligence as a core of your major, which is it's a pretty interesting phenomenon. It's not even something that appeared 5 years ago. So today, an average student who studies computer science, which is about 40% of Stanford's graduating population, of the let's say 100 courses that they would take, about 50 of them are in artificial intelligence. Now, I think that what's an important distinction to make here is that these courses are talking about, you know, what we've been knowing for the past 10, 15 years. And what's happening now is that a lot of these entrepreneurs leave Stanford, they take these skills and they go and they innovate on an existing market or a new market, leveraging existing technologies. And this brings me back to a conversation I heard Eric Schmidt give actually in Israel. He was the former chairman of Google. And I remember that he was talking about the Israeli ecosystem. And one of the amazing things that he said was that this idea of innovation through necessity. And this is something that I haven't yet seen anywhere outside of specifically even my own unit, which was the cybersecurity unit, which is one of the foundations of the Israeli tech ecosystem. There are a few, but this is a core one, which is the idea that we're given very limited resources. And a lot of times we have to innovate on top of the existing technologies to meet that demand. And I remember vividly, I was an officer in the Army and I was dealing with artificial intelligence projects, and I would be given very limited resources with a very complicated problem. And I would go to my commander and I would say, okay, I need 3 more people. I need these GPUs. I need these big servers. And they said, okay, well, you can't, because this is what you have and you must succeed. And what ended up happening is that we spend days and nights just researching and innovating on top of existing technologies, which I think is really something in the Israeli mindset. And I'm thankful to have both of the perspectives of all Stanford saying, okay, innovation through education and then going and leveraging that into the market. Whereas what I'm seeing in the Israeli startups is this idea that resources are always limited and we have to be one step further in terms of the technology, in terms of the intellectual property, because we don't have endless money and we don't have, you know, that luxury of being able to just bring whatever resources we can. And I think that that's also a big part of that success that I'm feeling. 100%. Now, Maria, what I'd like to bring back to you, which you said before, was this idea that things have been shifting a little bit and it's become sort of a commodity. And I do think it's an important distinction between those that are just using, you know, ordinary artificial intelligence to remain relevant versus those that are really building the next layer on top of it and are really innovating, which I think you touched on that a little bit.
Yeah, so I think when you look at, you know, when we started reading about machine learning, I don't know, 20 something, 30 years ago, it was kind of a subset. And then in the last 10 years ago, you start seeing companies kind of entering, building algorithms, building those heavy mechanics of the data platform that is needed What we're seeing today is basically, I'm careful of using the word commodity because it takes a lot of expertise and skill set. But AI is basically redefining how startups look at a market, how they're building their products. And 3 years ago, or 4 years ago, sorry, when we launched the AI studio for Google, one of the understandings that we've had is basically the data thinking and the AI thinking into the company changes every aspect of the company. Now, the reason I chose this slide to present to you guys is basically to see that AI-driven software is changing every vertical and every aspect of the business. And it's no longer limited. It's no longer a vertical by itself. It's basically the fuel. So anything from healthcare, improving examinations, improving testing, into fintech, assessing risk, enabling loans, enabling the whole financial system to drive. Enterprise software, end-to-end, is changing in every aspect, from security to managing internal data to managing employees and HR. I've seen amazing examples on customer service. I mean, we have to understand that machine learning drives our lives today, from our phones, through our tablets, through our website, through everything that we do. But companies that are smart enough to leverage AI are basically redefining verticals. And you can see some amazing examples. I think from your side, Michael, you had the experience of working with Hippo, which is an uprising, amazing startup. I'm biased because I love the entrepreneur as well, but an amazing startup there. You see what Lemonade is doing to the insurance market. These would not be possible for such small companies, startups with an idea, to take over a market or to redefine a market and disrupt a market without the leveraging of data and having 1,000 users and treat them as 100,000. Take 100,000 users and treat them as millions, in the ability of the backend computing to really realize, assess, and think and recommend on top of the amazing engines that they've built. Michael, do you want to share a little bit from your experience with some of these companies?
What I've been observing within Hippo specifically is this extraordinary ability to come into an existing market. And for those who don't know insurance, you're in a good place, because it's very weird to understand that we have this market that is thousands of years old. I think insurance is perhaps one of the oldest markets that ever existed in society. And it turns out that until about 10 years ago, they were still working with spreadsheets, or even worse, with binders and physical paper. And now you have a lot of the big companies transitioning to spreadsheets, what they call the cloud. But really, I think the revolution that we're seeing with Hippo and Lemonade and Next Insurance, the three big unicorns that happen to be Israeli, what they're doing is they're digitalizing and they're leveraging this idea of using artificial intelligence to map out the whole spectrum and understand, both on the risk side, what are risks that we should be able to take as an insurance company, but also just on the data side, getting any grasp of who are our customers, what are we actually trying to do, what are we insuring, and those fundamental understandings. I'm shocked that we still have industries that don't have that basic understanding, and there are a lot of them. I think one of the interesting things that are important to note about specifically the Israeli ecosystem that I'm observing in regards to early stage investing and in regards to artificial intelligence companies is this question of how do you even check what is a valid artificial intelligence company. Today everybody loves to put artificial AI on their slide deck. It used to be machine learning, then people realized that AI is a sexier word, so they changed, but still few people truly understand how it works and to be able to do due diligence on this. And I think one of the very special things that I've been observing in my community is that since they say that Israel is all 1 degree of separation, the world is 6 degrees. And so here, whenever we have an entrepreneur coming with this idea or this technology, I probably would know their commander from the army, or Roy would probably have on his WhatsApp, somebody that they worked with before. So I think it's very special also in terms of being able to actually understand fundamentally what is the technology that is being built besides the big buzzwords, and whether that technology is actually proprietary and is actually interesting, which is something that I haven't seen. I haven't seen too much outside of here.
Super cool. I think we have a couple of questions that have already been raised. So I would love to address the questions before we move on. Although this
Wonderful.
is exciting to talk about.
Wonderful. So we're talking about a gap between where investment companies from the UK, US meet startup companies and understand their offerings. So a little bit about this geographical barrier and this cultural barrier, and how that can be mitigated today. That is to you, Rui.
So we really don't see geographical barriers anymore. I think, taking a step back, we're all educated on the lean development. And, the whole strategy behind lean development has been quick iteration, break some eggs on the way, experiment, test, validate, ship, test again, fix, ship again. I think the whole concept of building AI first companies is investing a lot in building your data backend, making sure that every user, every experimentation, every engagement is recorded and built. But today, really, when I first landed in San Francisco, I think it was 7 years ago, there was a lot of discussion about the need for startups to be present there to gap the market differences. And I think what technology does and what a lot of smart startups do, when they create fractionless, zero touch, download and use, these geographical barriers have kind of disappeared, kind of melted away. And what you have today is more of the cultural go-to-market, but not necessarily driving the technology. That's why a lot of companies do keep their R&D in Israel, although, the beautiful thing about the Israeli market is that there is no Israeli market. You don't build products for the Israeli market because, for 9-10 million people, you're not going to try and sell anything here. But you'll see a lot of successful companies who penetrate the US market, who scale, and still keep their R&D, their support, their QA here, just because there's really no global barrier anymore for us to cross. This is technology. You get online, you download, you use. There's really no need for that mitigation that we needed in the past of mobilizing teams and rehiring and all of that. That has all changed. Anything on that, Michael, you want to add?
I think that what you're saying is exactly right, and I think that what I'm excited about is seeing how this will continue to change and continue to evolve in the next coming years. What I suggest in the interest of time, Ray, is that we talk a little bit about AnD as an early stage vehicle, and more interestingly for me, I would love to hear about how strategically AnD can be placed inside of the Israeli ecosystem. And we have a lot of venture capital funds. We have a lot of them in Israel. We have a lot of them in California. We have a lot of them in Europe. A lot of them are also active in the Israeli ecosystem because it is such a miracle of the startup nation. But there is a lot of thought and intentionality that needs to go behind being a good early stage fund within Israel. And I think that what AnD has to offer is pretty unique. And I'd love to hear from you a little bit about the strategy behind that.
Super, super cool. So first is maybe in 30 seconds discussing why early stage investments in Israel. Eventually, as a venture capitalist and as a passionate company builder, if you look at the cycle of growth of companies, Israel is probably the best market for early stage investments. The first 2-3 years are the most critical for any startup, but also the most profitable from return perspective. And since we like to get our hands dirty, and as Lee said, that I said that we are mechanics, this is usually where we like to come in and basically build a whole apparatus of support for our companies to make sure that we make those 2-3 first years of operation count. That after us, it's the growth funds, it's entering the US or other international markets and basically exploding. But these 3 years are critical and at the same time are very rewarding if you're a smart investor, both on the selection and on the ability to support entrepreneurs. Now, before we move to the next slide, which I love because it's overcomplicated and overwhelming, but it explains the model. When you look at any startup ecosystem, and I think that my job in the last 6 years has been traveling around the world and seeing these ecosystems and their gaps, there are very core elements of what makes a successful startup ecosystem and your ability as an investor to support. So first and foremost is obviously the deal flow. How do you get to the entrepreneurs, to the right entrepreneurs with interesting ideas in time? Second thing is, how do you leverage the fact that there are so many corporates in each one of these industries and verticals that we want to disrupt that can be the early validators to provide POC opportunities, to basically give the startups the entry point in a very early stage in their growth, that they can save a lot of time, or as we call it, make the new mistakes and not repeat the old mistakes that this industry has already experienced. The third is early stage startups are always limited on budget and limited on their ability to hire talent exponentially. They can't. So every founder that you'll work with is very strong in something. In Israel, it's usually technology. Usually every startup that we meet, the technology is covered end to end. As I said, people here adopt new technologies and new developer tools very quickly. But looking at other elements as marketing, growth, customer success, building the apparatus of a company is usually when they'll have challenges before they get to the right size. And this is a huge gap that you need to cover. In addition to that is, how do you get the Israeli technology the fastest to the international markets, which is also an important thing, because always remember there's a founder, beautiful strategy, beautiful technology, but now they need to start educating the market and penetrating different locations around the planet that are relevant with very limited resources. And last but not least is, how do we break that paradigm that as an investor, I need to spray and pray. I need to invest in a lot of companies, expecting 1 or 2 of these companies to become unicorns and basically pay for the not so good investments I made in the other companies in our portfolio. So this is exactly what we've built. This is exactly where we look at from the AnD perspective. AnD is a platform for early stage startups in Israel. We're first and foremost investors, but as Lee said, we're a working money. We are the power money. We are the partners with our founders on how to build these companies. First and foremost, we create a unique deal flow in Israel through running accelerators. Nothing beats 6 months of working with founders, with the team, to see how they execute day in and day out. This is a huge competitive advantage for us to know ideas and teams very, very early, and from them to be basically assess which are the leading people who would drive things forward. The second thing that we do is we're building around us a corporate platform. And that corporate platform are those individuals within corporations around the world who can validate, who can give access to data, who can give access to and opportunities for POCs. You can basically validate that what these startups are building is relevant, is part of what they see as the roadmap for the future. And as you know, more than 50% of startups fail because they build a product that actually nobody's going to pay for or nobody needs. So that validation is very critical, and get the maturity of these global corporates with these early stage startups is magical when done right. And then you come in as an investor, and as I've said before, you look at the whole set of needs that these companies have. You assess their blind spots, you assess the areas where they need more support. And instead of expecting these startups to overspend or basically suffocate themselves with the limited budget and the limited investments they were able to get at that point, this is where we become the complementary founders and help them actually cover these areas. Now, this is a very interesting point when we talk about the age of AI, because AI is way more than just technology. When you hire, when you build a company, when you design your product, when you're thinking about the user experience, when you're thinking about your growth strategy, it's all impacted by your data strategy and how you're building your company and product. And this is where we make sure and work with founders that are very early on already planning what do they want to get to. Because as I've said, unlike lean development, when it comes to data companies or database companies, if you don't build infrastructure right in the beginning, it'll be very difficult to course correct as you go forward. And another element that we've built into AnD is obviously the markets of where we want to connect quickly in order to help these early stage startups ship their products, create joint ventures, create opportunities, and penetrate new markets. So what you see before you is a lot of work. And I think what you see before you is way more of what you think a regular investor would do. But that's our strategy of basically putting all of our efforts, time, and energy into building the most robust apparatus we can to help our startups succeed. And because we come in with our support, because we come in with high stakes, with a very small portfolio, and I would say the opposite strategy to spray and pray, we're able to capitalize on a much higher rate of success when it comes to these companies being acquired in the future, and not necessarily wait for that one or two unicorns that would cover the cost for the rest of our work.
Great. Explain to me a little bit more about this idea of the global environment, because that is something that is uniquely special to Israel, and the fact that our ecosystem often stays within Israel until an exit strategy. And that is why previously we were called Exit Nation. Now we're called Scale Up Nation as we do go more global. And I think that the strategy that you have for AnD is pretty interesting and very compelling in how you're saying, okay, we are a part of the Scale Up Nation because of the global network. So talk to me a little bit about more about that.
Perfect. So I think there are two aspects to the globality of Israel, and I see Israel as kind of a global powerhouse. So on the good side, as Lee presented before, you're not going to see a lot of global corporates who don't already have a representation in Israel. Google has one of its biggest R&D sites here. Same with Facebook. Amazon has a huge team. Microsoft, which I used to work for, has a huge team. So everybody's here. The challenge is that you've got two forces from the corporate world side that are kind of clashing here in this ecosystem. So on the one hand, you have a lot of corporates who come here for the talent, and they want to hire the best developers, they want to hire the best tech people they can, and they want to identify the early stage opportunities very early on, so they can basically be able to invest, acquire, at a very low valuation. When you look from the perspective of the founders, they need a little bit of a different integration into the corporates. And one thing that this whole COVID crisis taught us is that corporates are global. Corporates have arms everywhere, but at the end of the day, the innovation, the R&D, the culture is in the home hub of these companies. So last week we launched our first JV in Tokyo, which basically enables us to bring Israeli technology to the backyard of these large Japanese corporates, and basically mitigate the cultural gaps of how these Israeli founders and technologies can integrate with the long-term innovation strategy that these corporates have. In the same way, we're building India, we're building New York, we're building San Francisco in a way that you will not be dependent on the local teams who sometimes have a different agenda. As a corporate, you're going to get the innovation handed to you in your backcourt. And for the startups, we basically enable that relationship building and basically alignment that they need to do. So this is kind of how we look at from the corporate strategy and why we invest so much time in building these global JVs.
Right, and I think that one of the big focus points of the Israel ecosystem has been this outreach, understanding how do you, from day one, find product market fit with customers across the seas in all sorts of domains. And I think that having that ability to go on a joint venture with corporates and having them be hand in hand with you throughout the journey, mainly as as concrete feedback, something that just today is very, very difficult to do. I think that is a huge value proposition that AnD is going to provide a lot of early stage companies that other funds just aren't able to. And it's specifically because of the background that you and Lee have and your other partners, that background of the globalization, whether it's on the corporate side from Google or with Angels with Lee, that really is a huge value. And I think that what I'd love to hear a little bit more is a little bit more about your background, a little bit more about Lee's background and the team, what makes up AnD Ventures.
Perfect. So I think when you look at kind of the group of people who came together to create AnD Ventures, we have Lee, who's been in politics for many years, basically being the chief of staff of the Israeli ambassador to the US. Lee has over 6 years of being a partner in an Israeli VC fund, seeing deals, integrating with investors, integrating with corporates and finding opportunities. Basically, Lee came from that education of being a smart investor and providing the added value beyond the funding. We have another partner who is sitting in front of me. His name is Ariel. Ariel is a product guy for most of his professional career, build the developer communities for LivePerson, build global businesses and opportunities for Amdocs. For me, before Google, I worked for Microsoft and LivePerson, where I met Ariel. Before that, for Deloitte and A Group. So we've got a partner by the name of Fir Kahlon, who's been managing deal flow and opportunities for another Israeli investment powerhouse, basically specializing in a lot of industries, doing the groundwork of understanding founders' opportunities and technologies. And we have Arnaud with us on the team, who has been a serial founder and entrepreneur, basically very connected in the European side of the world, but has seen and developed and led business formation and founding startups and technologies. So we've all been educated from a little bit different aspects, but at the end of the day, I think what brought us together is our one-stop shop desire for founders. Basically build a fund that does right by founders, that helps them build companies, that accelerates the VC model that we've seen so far, bring the good elements, but also expedite the process, because we think the more the time moves forward, the speed to launch, the speed to scale has to be also adapted by the investor side. And I think we all agree that investors are no longer just the money in the check. There has to be a very strong commitment from the investor to the company to go hand in hand and go through the millions of challenges these founders will have to go through in order to be successful. And we're committed to do that on their end. And I think that's what drives us all when we wake up in the morning.
Amazing. Great. Well, I believe that, we've gone a little bit into the Q&A time, and I know that there are a couple questions. What I'd love to do, if possible, is to, if you have a question, just click on the raise hand and ask that question personally. I think it'll be much more engaging than if I read it out. So if you have a question, go ahead, unmute and ask it. Jan, I believe that you had a question, right? Well, I think that what Jen was writing to me before, at least, was this idea of building products as new products versus optimizing for existing circumstances. And what I think is relevant here is in the context of, from your perspective on the investment side, completely bringing new products to fruition versus taking an existing product and making it better through the use of AI. And so where do you see the Israeli ecosystem in response to that?
Perfect. That's a very good question for you, Michael.
Well, I think that we see we see the two sides, and I think that they're very fragmented. We have groups that are taking AI and are saying, okay, we have a market like insurance. It's an age-old market, and we have this low-hanging fruit that through very traditional means of machine learning that we've actually seen since the 1950s, we can completely revolutionize and change the way people interact with the product. But then we're seeing groups saying, okay, well, what's actually going to be our problem in 5 or 10 years? And where do we want to be there? And what are the biggest problems that the world is going to face that we can leverage technology? And you know, we're seeing deep fakes all of a sudden rising up from the ashes in the last 2 or 3 years. I think it's technology that we're not even comprehending to understand what they're going to do, but it's this idea of leveraging artificial intelligence in ways that we don't yet know how to expect. We're seeing incredible companies in the agriculture space, for example, almost inventing new problems, but they're not really new problems. They're problems that have been in existence for a while, just people haven't really been talking about them. And I think that through artificial intelligence, we're discovering that we have a breadth of these problems. And I think that through this idea of innovation through necessity, we're able to discover them because we are, you know, our own little powerhouse that we have to continuously provide internally. So I think it's a very interesting point of view, but that's from my perspective at least.
No, that was a brilliant answer. I think you know, as you see what each tech revolution is doing, it enables us as human beings to tackle challenges in a totally different way. So, you know, I remember the day, I'm sorry, Michael, it was before your time, but when I was in Microsoft, you know, you'd sell these big metal boxes, servers, that companies used to keep in the office, and you had all the complications of, oh, I need more memory, I need to buy more memory cards, I need to bring more of these metal boxes, where cloud kind of revolutionized. On top of cloud, you have Google and you have Microsoft basically developing sharing and interaction platforms that people can work anywhere on the planet, share ideas and collaborate. So the cloud revolution is taking us up to one point, but today cloud combined with machine learning enables you to look at problems in a way you just couldn't look at them before. It's not that we didn't know these problems existed. It's just that now we have a much faster car that can define for itself where it wants to drive. So all I need to do is pose the question or pose the challenge and let the machine come back to me at a much faster scale on what should be done and how I should treat the data and analyze it. So, you know, AI is not just for startups. You see a lot of corporates around the planet changing a lot of the models and a lot of the ways they've done. And, you know, if you looked at that slide that I shared about where AI-driven startups go to, a lot of it is corporate solutions, basically new tools for corporates to just ramp up their business, deal with old problems, just solve them better, and do them in a more efficient, smarter way. So I think this is kind of how you complete the picture on that specific question. Any last question that we have?
You have a question, Bobby Jones, Pacific West Coast. It's a little bit early here. 2 questions. The investment terms for these startups, are they generally in a convertible notes, equity, and what's generally the time frame for the exit for the next round? And then my second question is, what is the social and moral responsibility of AI in regards to racial profiling, and how will Israeli fight against discrimination on AI that currently has been existing in fintech and other industries? Thank you.
Perfect. So that can be another session just by itself, just on these 2 questions, mainly the second one. I'll talk about the first one because, you know, we see, as I said, the innovation speed has basically cut itself by half from what we were used to 10 years ago. So from getting with a few friends in a garage, thinking about an idea, building a website, building a mock-up, building a beta product, experimenting, everything has been on steroids. And this is where, again, I think as investors, we need to speed our work as well and to become complementary with that race. Otherwise, you're running after a train and you'll never run fast enough. So, you know, usually when you look at early stage startups, there's a window of a year or 2 in the beginning where they get the seed funding and they run, but we're seeing that window getting shorter and shorter before these companies actually start setting themselves up for the next round. And this is where, as part of our fund strategy, we want to even expedite faster. So our idea is you take an amazing team in Israel, amazing technology. In West Coast terms, which I missed the West Coast, I haven't been there in over a year. In West Coast terms, you basically do all the adaptation and getting that company ready for scale. And the idea is basically in very fast pace to get the technology in front of US-based users or other international users, help that company grow very fast so it hits the metrics of round A much faster than it used to bring the other round, the more advanced round of funding into them. The question about convertible notes, safe, yes or no, it's very different from company to company, but I think the safe methodology, I think first deployed by YCOM, has become very, very common in early stage startups, especially as they look at the kind of the first money into the company. And it also makes your life easier a little bit as an investor because it puts you in a position where the company still has to prove itself and your position is pretty much secured as you move forward. So I think there's a win-win in that structure. There are also a few limitations and a few risks you need to be smarter as an investor to cover for, but that happens. About the ethics of machine learning, I totally agree with you that there are risks. We've seen challenges and we've seen imperfections. I think there is always the risk of bias when you deal with data. Are you really inclusive in your approach to data? Are you inclusive in your approach to what you're collecting and what you're monitoring to make sure that the outcomes of your machine learning platform is not biased? Because basically bias in, bias out. I just invented a new sentence, but I love it. But that's kind of the challenge that you have. And, I remember at Google, and I know that other companies are actually forming teams internal to deal with that bias, to deal with that issue, to make sure that this amazing new technology is used for good and supporting the world and making it better and really coming to fruition where we need it to be, instead of bringing I think from your examples, the examples of where it's not working that well, where we've seen in the past that it's not going to work that well. But this is, as any other technology and as any other evolution in technology, there's a level of maturity of where you understand the potential, you understand the risks, and you start to mitigate the risks. So we should not be afraid. We should embrace AI, but we should also always keep in the back of our heads, how do we identify the risk? Who has the incentive of dealing with that risk, which is also a big question, as you can see in some of the new Netflix films that came out. So it's still interesting, it's still out there, it's still unsolved, but I can tell you that in Israel, in Silicon Valley, in many places around the world, there are a lot of great minds that are thinking about analyzing and making sure that these are non-biased platforms. And that's, as I've said, a whole session by itself, which is totally mind-blowing and fascinating. Thank you for that question, but I don't think we're going to have time to cover every aspect we've seen on that front. But thank you again. And I want to be thankful for the smart people asking smart questions during this session. I'm always happy to address a lot of these questions personally. So please feel free to share our contact details, and I would love to engage with everybody who wants to have an intelligent conversation on how do we drive the high-tech industry forward from Israel and globally. Always excited about these opportunities. Michael, me, Michal, Ariel, Kfir, Lee, we're always here for that, and we'd love to engage with anybody who wants to engage with us.